The recruits thought it was over, that the last wave of masked fighters had fallen, but the officer knew better, and so did she. The way her eyes remained fixed on the far end of the hall told him she felt the tremor before it arrived, the faint vibration. Through the floor, like something massive was drawing closer. The recruits were still cheering, still catching their breath, their relief swelling like a tide ready to drown them. Yet her silence carved through the noise and froze their voices in, their throats. The heavy steel door at the far end of the hall began to glow faintly, its edges shimmering with heat. The recruits stared as the metal bent inward, then outward, buckling like paper under invisible force. The instructor stepped forward, shouting for everyone to brace themselves. The officer gripped his rifle tighter, his breath shallow in his chest. Then, with a shriek of torn hinges, the door ripped from its frame and slammed against the wall, and through the smoke stepped a figure, far larger than the rest. He wore heavier armor, blackened and scarred, his helmet marked with crimson lines that glowed faintly. His weapon, unlike the rifles the others carried, was a monstrous gun, its barrel thick enough to shred concrete with a single burst. The recruits panicked again, scrambling backward, some shouting for cover, others frozen as the figure leveled his weapon. The instructor raised his rifle, fired 3 shots. They sparked against the armor, harmless as rain. The massive soldier did not flinch. Instead, he stepped forward slowly and deliberately. Her eyes narrowed as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. She slung her rifle across her back and drew a sidearm. Her movements deliberate, slow, even, graceful, as though the chaos around her did not exist. The officer blinked in disbelief, wondering why she would holster the weapon that had carried her through the fight. But then he noticed the calmness, the certainty in her stride. She was not guessing. She was not hoping. She knew exactly what she was about to do. The armored soldier opened fire, the roar deafening the hail of bullets tearing through walls, and floor recruits dove screaming, the air filled with dust and smoke. But she did not dive. She did not flinch. She ran forward into the storm, her body weaving impossibly between streams of bullets, her sidearm flashing once, twice again, the sound of her shots lost in the thunder. Yet somehow each one precise sparks flew from weak points. In the armored plates, the officer stared as though witnessing something unreal. The recruits who had once doubted her now watched her in stunned silence, their fear overshadowed by the impossible sight of one woman advancing against a storm that should have torn her apart. Each step she took made them feel something strange, something heavy in their chest, like pride, like faith. They began to reload with trembling hands, their eyes never leaving her form, as though her courage alone demanded. They rise with her. The officer, too, felt it, the pull of her certainty. The armored soldier stumbled slightly as one of her bullets found a seam in his armor, but he steadied instantly, and his weapon roared louder. He unleashed a spray that shattered, the pillar near the officer hurling him to the ground. He gasped, choking on dust, his ears ringing, and through the haze he saw her leap to the side, rolling and coming up behind cover. Her eyes flicked across the hall, calculating distances, angles. Lines of fire. Her hand tightened on the sidearm, her breath unshaken. Then she did something none of them expected. She shouted her first command, her voice sharp, cutting through the chaos with authority that brooked no argument. She told them to flank, left to pour fire at the armored soldier and to trust her timing. The recruits hesitated only for a moment. Then something in her tone, something in the way she commanded them, left no room for doubt. They obeyed. Bullets rattled against the armor, distracting the enemy just as she broke from cover again. She surged forward, this time faster, her sidearm barking with ruthless rhythm, her shots driving into the same seam she had marked before sparks exploded with each impact. The armored soldier swung his weapon to cut her down. But in that moment, the recruit's fire pinned his stance, locking his movements just long enough for her final shot to land. A burst of light flared, the armor cracking along his chest. He staggered, dropping his massive weapon, his head snapping back as the impact rang through the hall. The armored soldier crashed to the ground, the thud echoing through the vast hall. Silence followed. Heavy and unbroken. Recruits stared with wide eyes, their rifles still raised, but their fingers trembling. The instructor lowered his weapon slowly, muttering in disbelief. The officer rose unsteady. His gaze locked on her, her chest rising and falling steadily as though she had only run a drill, her expression unreadable. Yet behind, her calm, he saw something darker, something hidden, and he knew the truth had only begun to surface. The hall was quiet, too quiet. The recruits still frozen in shock at what they had witnessed. The armored soldier lay motionless, his massive gun cracked. Beside him, smoke rising from its ruined core. The instructor ran a hand over his face, still trying to process the impossible. The officer stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching over shattered debris, his eyes never leaving her figure. She stood, still, her weapon lowered, but her gaze distant, as though her mind had drifted somewhere far beyond the ruined hall. She finally spoke, her voice soft, yet sharp enough to cut the silence. She told them the fight was not over. Her words confused the recruits who believed they had already faced the worst. She pointed toward the far wall where faint vibrations echoed once more. The officer frowned, realizing she had felt it before any of them had the tremor that signaled more were coming. But this time her tone carried something else, something colder, like she knew who was waiting on the other side of the wall. The recruits exchanged fearful glances, some whispering that they could not handle another wave, their bodies exhausted, their ammo low, their courage drained, yet her eyes locked on them steady, unwavering, and for reasons they could not explain. They steadied themselves too. The officer felt it again, that strange gravity in her presence. She was not just giving orders. She was binding them with her certainty, pulling their fear into her own and holding it there as if she had carried the burden countless times before. The steel wall at the far end groaned, then split open, and instead of soldiers, a single figure emerged. Tall, unarmored, cloaked in shadow, the recruits raised their rifles, hands shaking, but she raised a hand, signaling them to hold fire. The officer hesitated, but obeyed. Sensing this was no ordinary foe, the figure stepped forward, light finally catching, his face scarred and familiar. Her breath caught the first sign of hesitation she had shown since the battle began. She whispered one word, a name, none of them recognized. The recruits glanced at each other, confused. The officer leaned closer, trying to hear her voice, but the name was lost in the echo. The figure laughed low and bitter, the sound reverberating through the hall as though the walls themselves remembered it. He taunted her, calling her by a different name, one the recruits had never heard, a name that did not match the woman they thought they knew. Their eyes widened as the figure spoke of missions, long-buried betrayals written in blood and shadows. Her expression hardened, yet her hands trembled slightly. The officer saw it clearly, though the recruits did not. She steadied herself almost instantly, but the crack in her mask had been revealed. The figure continued stepping closer, his words weaving a story of shared pasts and broken oaths. He claimed she was not who she pretended to be, that once she had fought on the other side, that once she had pulled a trigger that had cost lives far too close to theirs. The recruits stared in disbelief. One of them whispered, asking if it was true, but she said nothing, her silence heavier than any answer. The officer stepped forward, trying to deflect the accusations, demanding the figure stop, but his words were drowned out by the echo of her past, now laid bare. The recruits tightened their grips on their rifles, torn between trust and doubt. The figure smiled, seeing their uncertainty, and raised his weapon slowly, daring her to prove where her loyalty lay, daring her to choose in front of all of them. Her sidearm rose in silence, her eyes locked on his weapon mirrored hers, the air frozen between them. The recruits waiting, The officer holding his breath, everything balanced on a single trigger pull. He smirked as though he knew she could not do it, as though he believed the past bound her forever. But in that moment, her voice rang out sharp and unshaken. She told him the past did not own her anymore, that the people behind her were her mission now, and she pulled the trigger. The shot cracked like thunder. The figure staggered, a look of shock in his eyes, before, collapsing to the ground, silence held once more. The recruits lowered their rifles slowly, uncertain what they had just witnessed. The officer stared at her, waiting for explanation, but none came. She holstered her weapon, turned away, and began walking. Toward the exit, her steps heavy but unwavering. The recruits parted for her, unsure whether to follow or to fear her. Yet when she reached the door, she finally stopped. She told them one final truth. Her voice steady, she admitted she had once been something else. Someone they would have hated. But she had chosen to walk another path, and in the fire of that choice, she would fight for them until her last breath. Then, without waiting for questions, she stepped into the shadows beyond the hall, leaving them with silence, leaving them with doubt, leaving them with awe. The officer followed her, with his eyes knowing her story was not over, knowing the war inside her had just begun. The alarm wailed through the training hall, its shrill cry bouncing off concrete walls, red lights spinning across the room, casting long, jagged shadows. Recruits clutched their rifles. Though none of them knew what to do, the instructor barked for order, his voice booming above the chaos. Yet even he glanced toward the range officer for clarity. The soldiers flooding in moved with urgency, not drill like precision. This was no exercise. This was a breach, and the recruits felt their stomachs tighten. The officer pointed toward the northern corridor, shouting that the perimeter had been breached. The recruits murmured nervously. None of them had expected live danger inside a controlled training facility, yet the sounds told no lies. Boots, pounding weapons, clattering orders, shouted over radios. The woman stood still amidst the noise, her eyes narrowing toward the corridor as if listening past the confusion. Her expression calm where the others showed fear. The officer saw it, and in that stillness, he recognized something buried. The recruits were ordered to stand ready, form lines, and prepare. But their movements were clumsy, disorganized, their fear spilling into every gesture. Some dropped magazines, others fumbled with safeties. The officer's frustration grew visible until his gaze returned to her again. She alone stood ready, her rifle cradled as though it were an extension of herself. No hesitation, no wasted motion. No doubt the instructor noticed it too, but before he could speak, the sound of metal scraping echoed from beyond the corridor doors. The doors slammed open, figures in black uniforms stormed through weapons, raised their faces hidden by masks, their movements practiced, not wild. These were not intruders. Stumbling by chance, these were trained fighters, armed and coordinated. The recruits gasped, panic sparking in their eyes. A few stumbled back. One dropped his rifle entirely. The instructor roared at them to hold position, but the enemy's precision shattered their fragile courage, and the line began to break before the first shot was fired. The officer raised his weapon, firing a sharp burst that dropped one of the masked figures, but more spilled in behind him, their advance steady and unrelenting. The recruits scattered, some firing wildly, others retreating toward the rear wall. The instructor tried to rally them, but the noise drowned his commands. The masked intruders pushed forward faster, stronger, their bullets tearing through the air. A hall that had echoed with laughter minutes before now echoed with screams, ricochets, and chaos, and still she had not moved. Her eyes locked onto the advancing figures, her breathing steady, her hands tightening around the rifle she had trained with. Moments before she stepped forward, one calm motion. Through the panic, the officer caught the shift in the recruits' eyes as they turned toward her unconsciously, as if sensing something about to change. She raised her weapon, and without hesitation, fired 3 precise shots, each one finding its mark, each masked figure collapsing instantly, and the hall fell briefly into stunned silence. The recruits froze, their panic halted by disbelief, their scattered formations stilled as their eyes tracked. Her movements, the officer felt his chest tighten, not from fear but from awe. She moved with a certainty that did not belong in this room, did not belong to any recruit. Her shots were impossibly fast, impossibly accurate, her body flowing with trained rhythm. This was not luck. This was mastery honed from something far beyond what any of them had imagined. The instructor stared, his lips parting. But no words came. The masked fighters hesitated now, their advance slowing as they recognized the sudden change. One of their leaders barked an order, and half of them fanned out across the hall trying to surround the recruits. The other half pressed forward, firing at the officer and instructor. She shifted her stance, her rifle snapping to each flank, her bullets cutting down those who tried to flank before they even closed the distance. The recruits gasped, some clutching their weapons tighter, others frozen in disbelief, unable to act. But the masked fighters were not finished. More boots thundered. Through the corridor, reinforcements storming in, carrying heavier weapons, their shadows long against the flashing red light. The officer realized the breach was larger than anyone expected. This was no random attack. It was a planned assault meant to capture or destroy. And as he turned his eyes back to her, he saw that she knew it too. Her gaze unwavering, her shoulders squared, her silence louder than the chaos, because she was preparing for what came next. The hall shook with the thunder of boots as more masked fighters poured in their weapons. Heavy, their formation precise, the recruits scrambled for cover, some firing blindly, others frozen in terror. Bullets sparked against concrete walls, the air thick with smoke and dust. The instructor bellowed for them to hold their line, but his voice cracked against the roar of gunfire. The officer crouched behind a pillar, returning bursts of fire, yet the numbers pressing forward threatened to overwhelm them in seconds. She moved differently than the rest, her body low and controlled, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the field of enemies. She fired once, twice, 3 times, each shot deliberate, each target falling, as if pulled by invisible strings. Recruits glanced at her in shock, their panic momentarily stilled by the impossible accuracy they witnessed. She gave no commands, yet her presence alone seemed to steady them. A silent force stronger than any shouted order. They began to follow her lead without even realizing they did. Masked fighters shifted their tactics. Recognizing her as the threat, they began to focus fire on her position. Bullets tearing through concrete near her feet, sparks flying across her shoulders. Yet she did not flinch. She rolled across the floor, firing as she moved, her bullets cutting through helmets and visors. The officer blinked at the speed, at the precision, at the way she turned chaos into something that resembled control. The recruits clung to that vision like drowning men to a rope. The instructor saw it too, his face pale, his voice no longer barking orders, but muttering disbelief. He had trained countless recruits, seen countless drills, but never this. Not even from seasoned veterans. She was moving with an instinct sharpened only by battlefields, the kind none of them had ever faced. The recruits began to fight more steadily, their fear pushed aside by the strange, unspoken confidence that if they followed her rhythm, they might survive. She was unknowingly leading them into formation. A masked fighter broke through the line, lunging toward a recruit, knife flashing in the red light. The recruit froze, wide-eyed, unable to move. She spun instantly, her rifle snapping upward, the shot echoing like thunder. The attacker crumpled. Mid-stride, before the blade could strike, the recruit gasped in shock, staring at her as though she had just reached down and pulled him from a pit. The officer watched closely, and he knew this was no accident. This was the mark of someone who had done it before. Then a deeper rumble shook the hall. The heavy door at the far end shuddered and burst open. 2 fighters rolled in, carrying weapons heavier than anything, yet machine guns mounted on bipods, their barrels gleaming under the red lights. They set up instantly, unleashing a storm of fire that tore across the hall. Concrete-shattered recruits dove for cover. The officer felt the breath ripped from his chest. They could not withstand that kind of firepower. Not without something more. Not without her. She sprinted low across the hall, bullets slicing the air above her, her body weaving through the chaos, her rifle slung tight against her. She slid behind one of the machine gunners, rising with a speed that defied thought. Her weapon barked. Once the gunner collapsed, she seized the weapon, swinging it in one fluid motion, and unleashed a storm back at the attackers. The other machine gunner staggered, struck before he could adjust. Recruits and soldiers alike stared wide-eyed at the transformation before them. The officer caught the look in her eyes as the muzzle flared. Not rage, not fear, but something colder. Something forged through years of combat experience that should not have belonged to her. The recruits whispered. Between themselves, their earlier doubts evaporating, replaced by awe and unease. The instructor finally found his voice, shouting to hold the line and to follow her lead. Yet even he knew he was no longer the commander here. She was the one holding the hall together. She was the reason they still stood. The masked fighters faltered for the first time, their momentum broken, their advance slowed. The hall littered with fallen bodies, smoke curling into the red light. The officer felt the tension shift. But he knew this was not over. He had seen battles before, seen the moment when enemies pulled back only to prepare something worse, something devastating. His gaze turned toward her, watching as she reloaded with mechanical precision. Her face, calm, her breathing steady, and in that calm he saw a past waiting to be revealed. The training hall buzzed with energy. That morning, recruits lined up in neat rows, their rifles slung over shoulders, the sound of boots striking concrete echoing through the space among them. She stood quiet and steady, her presence drawing little attention, her uniform crisp yet unremarkable. The others glanced at her with half-hidden smirks because they had already judged her before she ever touched a weapon. They thought she did not belong, and they were eager to prove it. When the instructor barked orders, the recruits surged forward one by one, taking their turns at the range. The air filled with sharp cracks of rifles' bullets hitting targets with varying accuracy, cheers and laughter following every near miss or lucky shot she watched. Each of them closely, her gaze calm. Her breathing measured, her hands relaxed, as though this was not a test, but something far more familiar, though no one else could see it yet. Though the officer watching from the shadows already did. At last her name was called. She stepped forward and lifted the weapon with precision, her posture flawless. But the recruits whispered and chuckled, their words carrying across the hall. They had seen others fail. They were certain she would falter. She aimed, slowly, her finger brushing the trigger with care. And then the shot rang out sharp and loud, reverberating through the range. The bullet tore forward, disappearing into the distance, and silence followed as the recruits waited to see her score. The target showed nothing. No hole, no mark, no sign of her shot. Laughter exploded from the recruits, loud and mocking, bouncing off the walls of the hall, their voices cruel and unrelenting. Some shook their heads, some clapped each other on the back, one even shouted that she should put down the rifle before hurting herself. Her expression did not change, her eyes steady, her body unmoving. She simply lowered the weapon with deliberate calmness that silenced even a few of them for a moment. The instructor frowned, his eyes narrowing as he studied her posture, the weapon, the stance. Something did not add up. His years of experience told him there was more to the shot than the recruits realized. He said nothing at first, letting their laughter burn out. Before glancing at the range officer who stood at the far edge near the control booth, the officer gave the faintest nod, his lips moving in a whisper just loud enough for those closest to hear. "Check the back wall." A hush fell over the nearest recruits, who turned their heads toward the far end of the hall, their laughter faltering as they squinted in the dim light. Slowly, one of them gasped, then another, pointing trembling fingers toward the thick, reinforced wall behind the targets. "A hole clean." and sharp punched deep into the concrete surface as if the bullet had flown past every target to strike the very foundation of the range itself. The recruits stopped breathing, caught in the realization of what it meant. The silence grew heavy almost, suffocating, the laughter gone, replaced with disbelief and unease. Some of the recruits stepped back, as though distance might shield them from the truth. Others tried to explain it away, muttering about luck or accident. But the officer's eyes gleamed as he traced the trajectory in his mind, understanding the impossibility of such a shot without control, without mastery, without a calm that only came from long experience. She had done something none of them could comprehend, and she was not finished. She stood still, weapon resting against her shoulder, her gaze sweeping the room slowly, meeting the eyes of those who had mocked her. Before her silence was louder than any words, the recruits shifted uncomfortably under her stare, as though exposed, their earlier confidence draining away. Yet they did not realize she had only revealed a fraction of what she carried. The officer saw it, though he had seen enough shooters to recognize a rare and dangerous gift, one that demanded to be tested again. Recruits stared at the hole in the back wall, their whispers breaking the silence like cracks in glass. One of them muttered that it was impossible. Another claimed she must have fired at the wrong angle or miscalculated her aim, but their voices were weak without conviction. The instructor did not speak. Yet his eyes betrayed curiosity and unease. He knew shots like that did not happen by chance, not in a place like this, not in front of so many witnesses, not without purpose. The range officer stepped forward, his boots echoing across the concrete floor, his gaze never leaving her calm expression. He ordered her to reload the recruits, chuckled nervously, whispering that the first shot had been luck and that the second would prove it. She did not argue, she simply obeyed, sliding the magazine into place with a fluid motion that revealed how natural the weapon felt in her hands. She raised the rifle again, and the air grew tight with anticipation as the range fell silent. This time, the officer gave no target to aim for. Instead, he told her to fire when ready anywhere on the wall. The recruits frowned, confused by the order. Some snickered, claiming the officer was setting her up for humiliation again, but she adjusted her stance, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, her breathing slow and controlled. The sound of her inhale carried across the hall, and in that moment, the recruits realized she was not nervous. She was measuring. She was calculating something unseen. The shot cracked through the hall sharper than before. The recoil firm, yet controlled. The recruits craned their necks, staring at the line of targets. But again, nothing showed, no new holes, no fresh marks, no evidence of the bullet having touched the standard field. Their laughter began to bubble again until one of them pointed trembling toward the steel support beam running along the ceiling high above the targets embedded. There was a hole clean and perfect where the bullet had struck true. The laughter collapsed, replaced by stunned silence. The recruits gaped at the impossible angle, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering that no one could bend a shot like that. Yet the truth was there, etched into steel, undeniable. The officer's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in recognition, for he had seen marksmen before, but never one with that kind of precision. She lowered her rifle once more, not a word spoken, her eyes cool and distant, as if she had expected this reaction all along. The instructor stepped closer, his voice low yet carrying across the hall, asking her where she had learned to shoot like that. But she gave no answer, her silence heavier than words, her eyes not even meeting his. The recruits shifted nervously, some now looking at her with something close to fear, others with reluctant respect. The atmosphere in the hall shifted, and the officer felt it too. The fragile line between disbelief and awe had begun to break, and he wondered how far she could go. Then the alarm blared sharp, and sudden the red lights flashing across the training hall. Soldiers rushed in from the far corridor, their faces grim, their weapons ready. The recruits froze, unsure if this was a drill or something more serious. The officer exchanged a glance with the instructor, a glance filled with urgency. This was not routine. This was something real, something dangerous. And in the chaos, the officer's gaze returned to her, knowing she might be the only one who could meet what was coming. She set her rifle down slowly. Her body tense, her eyes narrowing toward the sound of boots rushing down the corridor, her hand brushing over the weapon as if considering lifting it again, but she held back for now. The recruits looked to her instinctively, even as they refused to admit it, sensing that her calm presence in that moment meant something none of them could yet understand. The officer took a step toward her, his voice steady yet edged with urgency, because the test was about to end.